Be'ez Hashem, today's daf, Be'ez Hashem, is Masechta Chullin Daf Samach Zayin, and we're going to begin from uh, Ema. Okay, let's just the Gemara is we're discussing a very interesting thing that's not so well known by people, and that is that there are in the Torah it tells you that if you're drinking something from water, if you're eating something from water, you're not allowed to take a creepy crawly thing, right? You're not allowed to eat a creepy crawly thing, but if it's in the water, you have two simonim. It has to have fins and scales. But the Torah says that only in the waters of rivers, oceans, then you need fins and scales. So what we know is that if somehow, let's take a picture of a bucket, right? A bucket full of water. If there was somehow spontaneous generation, okay, let's call it spontaneous generation, and it somehow was created on its own a creature in this bucket of water. Even if it did not have fins and scales, you would be allowed to eat it, okay? Even if it did not have fins and scales, because the Torah only requires you to have fins and scales only if it's found in a river, right? But if it's found in a pail, you don't have to have it. Now, what the Gemara was discussing is what about a well that goes into a ditch, right? A well that goes into a canal. So a natural well is very similar to a river. So we could say that even if you find a creature in this body of water to your right, it would also would require fins and scales. However, we have a drasha that if you make a hole in the ground and rainwater came in like a pit in the ground, it has a din like a pail. You don't need fins and scales. You can eat any creature that's created in this pit. And that's the key over here. So that's the drasha over here. Why do we have such a drasha? Because the pasuk says, anything in water you could eat. Here's the first pasuk. You could eat in water. So it's an extra oisei techelu. We darshan that you could eat anything in water, even if it grew in a pit. You created a pit and somehow a creature came there, was created there. You're allowed to eat it without fins and scales. So let's begin on Daf Samach Vava Mebeis. Heichen Hirter Bekalim. Heichen Hirter Bekalim. Where do we see in the Chumash that you are permitted to eat any creature that generates in a bucket? And says the Gemara, you can eat anything that comes out of water. If it comes out of the oceans and the rivers, then you have to have islay. Then you have to have the two simonim, fins and scales. The lesle, if it doesn't have fins and scales, don't eat it. But if it generates from kalim, even if it doesn't have fins and scales, boom, you could eat it. So says Gemara, how do you know it's lenient by kalim? How do you know we go easy when it's in a bucket? Maybe let's say the opposite. Even if it has fins and scales, don't eat it. Never eat a creature. Maybe the Chumash is telling you, don't eat a creature that's found in a bucket of water, no matter what. And says the Gemara, that you can't think. The ksiv, the pasuk says, the Torah tells you if it doesn't have fins and scales in the oceans, then don't eat it. So in the oceans, the lesle, if it doesn't have loy teichel, don't eat it. But if it's in a bucket, afagav the lesle, even if it doesn't have echol, you could eat it. So therefore, we know for sure that if it's found in a bucket, you can eat it no matter what. No matter what. We darshan that even if it's found in a pit, you could also eat it. Now, the difference between a pit and a bucket, as you can see, is the pit is is in the ground, so it's more similar to a river. And yet, we compare it to a bucket, and therefore, you're permitted to eat any creature that's found in a pit of water. Says the Gemara. Gemara says we're up to 5 lines from the bottom. The Ema, let us say, b'mayim klal, b'yamim nechol and prat, klal prat, ein b'chlal l'mashim prat, yamim nechol and itzim charitzim loy. The Gemara is asking, maybe we have a klal and prat in the pasuk to teach you that the only time you need fins and scales would be if it's found in the river. But if that's dafka, klal prat. Only if it's found in the river, then the Torah requires you fins and scales. But if it's found in this well over here on the right side, so maybe if you find it here, you don't need fins and scales in a natural well. And certainly you will not need fins and scales in a pit and not need fins and scales in a bucket. So how do you know that? Answers the Gemara, no. B'mayim cause of a cloud. You have 2 times in the pasuk it says b'mayim. Let's see the pasuk. B'kol asher b'mayim. B'mayim again, it says right here. B'mayim once, b'mayim twice. So that's anything in water you could eat. That's 2 klolim. And b'yam and necholim, then the Torah tells you specifically oceans and rivers. So it's like a cloud, prat cloud. So we say, we darshan only similar things to a river. Why is a well similar to a river? Because it originates from underneath the earth. It originates from underneath the earth, and it flows. So it's similar to a river. So says the Gemara, B'mayim chazaklau. Says the Gemara, Hani trei klolis d'smichela dadaninu. That's not a klal prat klal. The 2 words mayim appear next to each other in the pasuk, right? In the pasuk it says kol asher b'mayim, kol asher loy stop it b'mayim. So the 2 klalim, the 2 generalizations are found near each other. And then you have the prat. So it's klal prat. So the Gemara says, in this situation, Amaravina, Kedamra b'marava, like they say in the West. If you have 2 klolis next to each other, we go to Amid Aleph. Hatal prat b'neim v'dunam b'klal prat b'klal. B'mayim klal, b'yam and echol prat, b'mayim chazo klal. Klal prat b'klal, iyatadon ela ke'ein ha'prat. In other words, this is sometimes the Chumash writes it that way. It doesn't get it the order 100%, but here, like you can see on the screen, the Torah wrote b'mayim b'yam nechalim. So b'mayim is 2 klalim. So whenever you find such a situation, you can like spread the mayims apart and put the yamim nechalim in between, and you'll have your klal prat the klal. And therefore, it's not just a river, but even a well also has these dinim of fins and scales. Ma prat mafurish, just like the detail, the example that the Torah gives, the river is mayim noivim, is flowing water. I've called mayim noivim, and so only flowing waters, but not a pit water. My rabbi charitzim unitzim, a long ditch or a wide channel lisura that you need. It's usher until you have fins and scales. What do we exclude? That a pit, right, a regular pit, a wide pit, or a cave that's not moving, then it's permitted just to bend and drink, and you don't have to worry about fins and scales. Says the Gemara of Eima Ma Prat Mafurish Maim Gedelim Al Kol Karka, Av Kol Maim Gedelim Al Gabe Karka. Maybe we'll include the pit, and we'll say that it's very similar to the detail. Just like rivers are in the ground, so any water that's in the ground requires fins and scales if you want to drink from that water, if you want to eat anything in that water. So my Rabbi, we're going to include afilu bar shichem aris lisuru. Why don't we include that even a pit water should be included in the isser that would require you to need fins and scales before you can eat any creature? Because it's similar. I mean, you could say that the river and scale, the Torah requires you fins and scales, right? So we'll say that the pit also, it's in the ground, it's similar to a river, so it's like similar to the detail. And let's say you also need fins and scales in order to eat something there. And what's my miyat? What's going to be the exception? Miyat kalim. If it's found if you found a creature in a bucket, then it's you don't need fins and scales. In Cain, but the Gemara says toichlu my hanile. We have an extra word as zet toichlu. It's an extra as zet toichlu mikolacha b'mayim. You could eat anything in water. So therefore, that adds another thing, that another body of water that does not need fins and scales, and that must be pit water. So that's the Gemara. That's the opinion of what we darshan now. But the Bei Rabbi Shmuel, Tana, the Rabbi Shmuel views it. Lemaisa, the Bei Rabbi Shmuel also has this problem. It's not really a klal prat, a klal, because you have b'mayim, b'mayim, and yamim necholim. So they view it as more of a liberal. It's like ribui miyat. Ribui means you include everything. Miyat means you exclude just a little bit, just the minimum. So what they darshan similar. Tana b'mayim shtei pamim ein zeh klal prat. That's not a klal prat. El ribui miyat. It's inclusionary and exclusionary. B'mayim ribui. When the Torah says mayim, it means includes every body of water, does not need fins and scales. Hear me? Sorry.
Okay, now yeah, you were by Rabbi Yishmael. It's not the first time, but the other time was less of a.
Okay, you see my screen?
No.
Yes. Oh.
No.
Yeah, I do. I see your screen now.
Okay. Okay. So now, sorry, I know I paid the bill. Anyway, Rabbi Shmuel Tana, b'mayim shtei pamim. Ein zeh klal prat. That's not a klal prat. El riba miyat. B'mayim riboy. B'yamim u'necholim miyat. It's exclusionary. B'mayim chazav riboy. So they darshan it as a riboy miyat riboy. Riba miyat to riboy. Riba hakol. Everything. You don't really need to find anything. You marba everything. My riboy. You marba charitzin in isin liyisura. You marba a well water that it's usher until you find fins and scales. What do you exclude? Bayer shich and maris latera. That bayer shich and maris, you don't need fins and scales. Everything is permitted in a pit water. It's similar to Bei Rabbi Shmuel Tanit. And the Gemara says, wait a second, Ema, why don't you say my riboy bayer shich and maris li yisurai umay miyat kalim? Why don't you say, since riboy is more inclusionary, so why don't we say that the chumash is marbe everything to the isser, and that we'll say pit water also is included that needs fins and scales, and the only exception is pale water that does not need fins and scales. So the Gemara says, but we have a pasuk of the extra word of toichlu that says that there's something else besides pale water that's permitted without fins and scales. So the next step up is pit water. Pit water also doesn't need fins and scales. Says the Gemara of Eipachana, why don't you turn it around? Why don't you say that pit water needs fins and scales and well water does not need fins and scales? You have to include something and exclude something. So why do you include a pit and exclude the whale or why do you exclude the pit from fins and scales and include the well? And like I said before, because a well is more similar to a river, and that's why a well also needs fins and scales to eat anything in a well. I'm going to include barish shichin like a pit water. It's similar to a vessel. It's a closed area, right? A vessel and a pit are both in a closed area, so they're very similar to each other. And and I'm going to exclude, a well water which is not like kalim, it's flowing. So therefore, that's what the Gemara is basically saying, that the most sense to compare to a river is a well. A well is compared to a river. It's not closed in, it's flowing. It's flowing somewhere. But a pit is more similar to a keli. And just like a keli does not need fins and scales, so also pit water doesn't need fins and scales. Now the Gemara just ends off with one thing, and then we'll go on to another thing. Where does the Torah tell you clearly that a keli, if it's found in a vessel, you don't need fins and scales? And where is it not so clear? The Gemara says sometimes it's clear and sometimes it's not clear. If in this pasuk over here, I'm not going to go into it, but in this pasuk over here, you can say, teaches you that in a keli, you could eat anything. You don't eat fins and scales. That's the clear pasuk. One period, and the other pasuk, which says that if it doesn't have fins and scales in the oceans, don't eat it. But you could also infer that if it's in a keli, you could eat it. That's not so clear. That's what one opinion says. The other opinion says no, the opposite. The other opinion says that the second pasuk is the clear one, and the first pasuk is the not clear one. My tama the Omar yesh le meforish. From that pasuk, you could see that the Torah permitted you with kalim. Not you don't have to look for fins and scales. My tama demand yom ein loy meforish. The high du kumoicha hecht imahach havamina bekalim afagav the islay name loy techal. Like we said in the beginning, because the first pasuk is not so clear. Because even if you learn the first pasuk and say, okay, the Torah says that in the oceans you need fins and scales, but that doesn't tell you that a keli without fins and scales you could eat it. Maybe without fins and scales you're not allowed to eat. Even without fins and scales or with fins and scales, you're never allowed to eat anything in a keli. So according to that opinion, the first pasuk is not so clear. Okay, let's go on to the next thing. Ama Rav Huna. Rav Huna said, beer, date beer had, in the time of Chazal, it had a lot of worms. So imagine, here's this picture, you have this worms. The Gemara says, don't pour it through into a sifter, because maybe some of the worms are going to end up in the sifter, and that means that they crawled on the earth. In other words, I've been telling you that if something is in a keli, you can eat it without fins and scales, but if it's started, climbed out of the barrel and started crawling on the ground, so then it becomes also to eat. So once the bugs come onto the sifter and then fall back into the vessel with the beer, it already was crawling on planet Earth somewhere. It wasn't in a vessel, and therefore it would be usher. So that's what the Gemara says. A person shouldn't pour beer through a straw sifter at night. Maybe some of the bugs are going to be stuck onto the sifter and then fall back into the cup. And then you're going to drink it. They're going to drink that beer, but that beer, although you weren't permitted to drink the beer prior to sifting, but after sifting it, the shrutzim already started crawling on something else besides the keli, and therefore it's a sheretz ala oretz. Says the Gemara. So ihachi every time b'monanami dilmel parish ledafna demanav hadanaf lemana. Why are you permitted to eat? The Gemara is asking, why are you permitted? Take a look at this vessel. If you drink from this vessel the beer, you're permitted, right? That he's holding on to. But maybe the bugs walked onto the wall of the vessel, so they were crawling. They were not in the water itself of the vessel, but the liquid, it was on the wall of the vessel, and therefore it should be usher to eat. Just like you're saying, if the bugs crawled onto the sifter, it's usher to eat the bugs because it's separated from the liquid. So if it separates from the liquid to the side of the vessel, it should also be usher. So the Gemara says no. The hasab hainu revusa. That's the way the bugs grow. They grow on the side of the wall or in the liquid. Where do you know that difference? The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. How do I know I'm allowed to walk to a pit and bend myself down and drink from there? And nothing. I'm allowed to go to a pit and drink and don't worry about it. Says the Gemara, but how could the Brisa say something like that? How do you know you can drink from a pit? Maybe the bug crawled onto the wall of the pit and then fell back into the water. How could I drink from the water of a pit? Answers the Gemara, that's the way the bugs grow. They grow on the side. They grow in the liquid, in the water of the pit. So same thing. You're not worried about the bugs crawling on the side of the wall of the keli. Amalei Rav Chizdel Rav Huna Tanadim Sailach. I have a brisa that aligns itself because the brisa says, "Kol hasheretz hasheretz ala aretz." If a crawly thing is on planet Earth, then you're not allowed to eat it. L'rabas yavchushim shesinina. Tama the sinina haloi sinina shari. It's only these mosquitoes that are found onto the mats of wine. If you sift it, then you're not allowed to drink that wine. But if you didn't sift it, you could drink the wine, even though there's bugs there, because they never had a chance to shoretz al haaretz. So we see a new thing over here. I'm not telling you across the board that every sheretz that's in a vessel you could eat it. It's only if it's in a bucket that it never crawled on planet Earth. But if it crawled onto planet, all right. Again, we had this. I got to see what the problem is. Okay, let's continue. So the Gemara says, Amar Shmuel. Shmuel said, Kishus shehisliya. Kishus shehisliya. If you have a cucumber that has worms. Now, the cucumber that has worms on it should be permitted because a cucumber is like a bucket. And therefore, if it has worms in it, if it's developed worms, you could eat it, right? But what happens be'ibeha when the cucumber is still connected to the tree? So asura, then it's asur. Mishum sheretz hasheretz al haaretz. It's asur because of sheretz hasheretz al haaretz. Lema misayale. Let us say that it's proof, because once it's still connected to the ground, it's still considered crawling on the ground. Lema misayale. Let's prove it. The Tanachada ala aretz l'hoitzi esazizin shabadasav v'yatushim shabaklisip v'tla shabatmarim shabagroigrus. All these types of bugs on these fruits, all these types of bugs on fruits are usher, are permitted. The Tanya idach kol asher sharis ala aretz l'rabis lash v'ikre zev sheikre gefanim. All these bugs on fruits are usher. What's the difference? When is a bug usher on a fruit and when is it permitted? My love, if the bug is on a fruit, when the bug is on the fruit while the fruit is connected to the tree, then it's usher. But when the bug developed on the fruit by itself after the fruit was disconnected from the ground, so then it's permitted. Exactly what Shmuel said. And says the Gemara, Loi, not so. The truth is that when it's on the fruit, it is always permitted. It is always permitted. But when is it asar? If it's connected to the ground, like kasha, if it's on the fruit itself, even if the fruit is connected to the tree, it's permitted. If the bug is on the tree itself, then it's asa. So the talas is on the main bulk of the zayis, the main bulk of the gethed of the vine. Then it's asar, and therefore, like over here, as you can see in the picture, if it's over here, then it's for sure asar. If the bug is on the fruit itself, even according, not like Shmuel, but even if it's connected to the tree, it would be permitted. Interesting. Now the Gemara continues with these bugs, and then we'll end in 2 minutes. Boya Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asked the question, Parsha. So now the bug fell off the tree, okay? Fell off the fruit of the tree, and it hit the ground, but never crawled on planet Earth. Umesa. It died as soon as it hit the ground. Mahu, is that bug permitted? It never walked on the ground. The Torah tells you, it has to crawl on the ground. Miktsasa mahu, or what happens? Only part of the bug came out of the fruit fell to the ground, okay? But part of the bug left the fruit, but not the whole bug left the fruit. So only part of the bug is crawling on planet Earth. Does that make the bug usher? La'avir ha'olam. Or what happens if, look at this, the picture over here, if it fell off the tree, never fell to the ground, and fell into somebody's mouth. Is that usher? Well, it never crawled on the ground, but potentially it could have crawled on the ground had it landed. Teku, this all remains unresolved. Vasi asked the question, the gag tomorrow, mahu, the gag garnisa mahu. If the bug moved to the top of the date, so it got out of the fruit itself and moved to the top of the date, or it moved to the top of the pit, or tomorrow to tomorrow, or it moved from one day to another date, but it did not crawl on planet Earth. Mahu, is that considered Sheretz ala Oretz? Teku. That's a question. Now the Gemara says like this: Amar Rav Sheshes B'rei Darvivi Kukiyani Asire. If you find a worm in the liver of an animal, right, or the lungs, so then you're also to eat. You shecht an animal, you find worms in the liver. It's also to eat. My tama. How did the worms get there? My alma also. It came from outside. It came from the ground. Actually, it was a worm that was living on earth and then came into the animal. So that's why it's also to eat. Baskif lo Ravashi asked the question, Ima alma also, if this worm came from somewhere else, lishtach derech then you should have seen it by the digestive system. If the animal ate worms, then it should be in the digestive system, not in the liver. The fact that you're finding it in the liver must mean it's spontaneous, generated in the liver. Others say, if you find it in the liver, it's mutter. Maitama mine gavli. It was created in the liver. It didn't come from outside the animal. It came from within the animal and never was a sheretz al haaretz, never crawled on the ground. Therefore, it's permitted. That's pashut, because if it came from anywhere else, then it would be in the digestive system. The fact that you're finding it in the liver or the lung must be that it came from spontaneous generation of the liver. The hilkasa, the halacha is kukiya.
I lost sound.
Yeah, we lost sound from Vahilchasa, from Vahilchasa on.
Is that kikiyani asura? If you find these worms in the lungs, it's permitted. Maitama meinam noyim b'aylei b'usna teloyim. The worms came through the nose. Probably the animal was sleeping. The worms walked through the nose, so it was crawling on earth first, and then went through the nose, and then got to his lungs. So therefore, if you find worms in the lungs or the liver, don't eat it. Now the Gemara, we're almost done. Darnia de bisra asira. If you find, when you peel away the hide and you find worms there, it's aser. The kavre, if you peel away the skin of a fish and you find worms there, sharian, it's permitted. Amalei Ravina leime. Ravina liked these type of worms, and he told his mother, Avle leave ania echel. Just mix the fish with those worms and I'll eat it, because the worms that are found in fish is permitted according to Ravina. So what's the difference? Why is it when you peel the skin of an animal and you find worms there, you're not allowed to eat it, and you don't say spontaneous generation, and when you find worms in the fish, you could eat it? That even the worms of an animal you're not allowed to eat. And why is it by the worms of fish you could eat it? When you shecht an animal, okay, the meat becomes permitted to eat, but those worms, they are like Aver Menachai. Those worms were moving about while the animal was still alive, and they didn't become permitted with the shechita of the animal. Only an embryo becomes permitted when you shecht the mother, but the worms become like Aver Menachai. Avodogim, there's no such a thing of Eva Menachai by fish. All you have to do is, fish something. Vahani kagavlim, and all you did was, these were just gathered there. Beteir kagavlim. So therefore, the fish of the worm of the worms in the fish, the skin of the fish is permitted. Tanar Rabbanan, Gemara says, the Torah tells you, don't eat these following creatures. Kol hoylech al gochem. Anything goes on its belly. Zenachash. Don't eat the snake. Koil l'rabis everything l'rabis shilshal. Vesadoyim l'shilshal. The earthworm you can't eat. Al arba, don't eat anything that walks on four legs. Za'akrav, don't eat the scorpion. Koil hoylech l'rabis eshas chipus. Chipushes, the beetle, don't eat. Vesadoyim l'chipuses, anything like the beetle. Marber raglayim, the Torah says don't eat anything that has a lot of legs. That's zanodal, that's the centipede. That's this picture over here, a centipede. And then a centipede versus a beetle. And then the Torah says, at kol, Rabbi says, doima. Anything similar to these creatures, don't eat. Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yosef ben Umaskis oimer. And this ends off this nice parak. Levyasan dog tarhu. The fish that we're going to eat by Mashiach is called the Leviathan, and you should know it's a kosher fish. Shnema, because Eev talks about the Levyasan, Gava afike maginim tachtav chadudei charash. So in the description, it describes it as it having fins and scales. It's not just this big whale that has fins and scales. Afike maginim ele kaskasim shaboy. It has scales. Tachtav chadudei charash. It has sharp things coming out of it, like the sharpness of potsherds. Elus and Apirim, these are the fins that it cuts through the waters. So that's how we end off this nice little parak. We start the next parak tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we start.
Oh, yeah.